All right, thank you. Okay, good afternoon, good evening or good morning, everybody that has been joining the live stream to the seminar-like panel, 140 Million Women Can't Be Wrong, with Barbara Ransby, Yulia Gradskova, Vanessa E. Thompson, Avery Gordon, and myself. It's a great pleasure to all have you here together, and thank you very much for joining in. Thank you also everyone that has been joining in now from various screens around the city and around the world. The 140 Million Women Can't Be Wrong, it's a seminar-like panel that takes place in the context of the MIST seminar after Eslanda Robeson, in conversation with Steve McQueen's end credits here at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin, the HKW, as we say. And I'm speaking from it at this moment. My name is Doreen Mende, and I conceptualized this seminar together with Avery Gordon, Katharina Wada, and Arti Sundar in conversation with. I would like to thank also to Stefan and Lama and Lutz and Astrid Gese for the translation tonight. So much invisible labor that takes place in order to make this live stream happen. It's a second iteration of a seminar-like setting in the context of the MIST seminar. A first one we had earlier with the opening of the MIST seminar end of October. And it's a great pleasure to continue today with 140 Million Women Can't Be Wrong. It's a great joy and an honor to introduce briefly this session that engages with a transhistoric potentiality departing from the struggles and the life of Eslanda Robeson, to whom the MIST seminar intends to relate not so much only biographically, but as a network of journeys and of friendships, including with Claudia Jones, Shirley Graham and W.E.B. Du Bois, Peggy Middleton, Diana and Franz Löser. The MIST seminar after Eslanda Robeson, in conversation with Steve McQueen's end credits, consists of an exhibition, a research display, an audio installation in the auditorium by Steve McQueen, and a series of conversations. It imagines an encounter between a Black feminist Pan-Africanist internationalism and a technopolitics of anti-fascism through the decades-long friendship between the Black anthropologist and feminist Eslanda Robeson, who also was a writer and a photographer and also a media analyst supporting her husband, Paul Robeson. Eslanda's friendship together with the Jewish German philosopher Franz Löser, who applied for citizenship of the German Democratic Republic in 1952 and finally was granted to become citizen in 1957. So they all met already in the late 40s in what has become known as the Peekskill Riot, when Paul Robeson performed one of his famous songs, Old Man River, in front and threatened by a white mob. And Franz Löser was part of the communist student movement back then to protect and to lifeguard Paul Robeson against the police brutality and the white mob that was trying to attack and to lynch Paul Robeson. This is the moment when Franz Löser, Eslanda Robeson, Paul Robeson already met. It's a friendship that reaches back in fighting fascism and anti-Semitism, colonialism, and it continues until the 60s, specifically also until 65, the moment when Eslanda Robeson passed away. And she has been traveling to the east of Germany many, many times, but to many, many other places as well. And I think Barbara Ransby will elaborate on that. The session to date departs from Eslanda's unpublished text, 140 Million Women Can't Be Wrong, 8 manuscript pages that is archived in the archive of Paul Robeson at Akademie der Künste in Berlin, that she wrote at her home, most likely in Enfield, Connecticut, at a moment when she and her husband Paul Robeson were banned from travel to work internationally by the anti-communist McCarthyite US government between 1950 and 1958, and specifically 53 is a year when they were called into the hearing to be evidenced the membership in the Communist Party as a black intellectuals. The essay 140 Million Women Can't Be Wrong was likely written around the Copenhagen Congress of the International Women Democratic Federation, the WIDF, in 1953. During this year, the WIDF lost its observer status in the United Nations, which accused the WIDF of being what Eslanda describes in her text as communist-dominated, and eventually the WIDF had been relocated from Paris to East Berlin, to the Straße unter den Linden in 1954, where it remained until 1992. The essay by Eslanda Robeson is written in a diaristic situated manner, which is formative for Eslanda's writings in general, and which situates her writing, as we could discuss, in a tradition of a black feminist emancipatory auto-theory writing. Eslanda evidences what Audre Lorde would call the mythical norm of oppression through her analysis of the intersection of race, gender, and communism, which the US and its allies, as Eslanda would describe it in her text, really wanted the WIDF to be out of the United Nations. Or, as Charis Burton-Stelly analyzed in her contribution to the past panel, Radical Provocation of the Miss Seminar, end of October, where she said, being black, being a woman, and being a communist is considered the greatest threat to white supremacy, oppression, and fascism. Situated here at the HKW, where I'm sitting and speaking from, the Miss Seminar aims to invoke a geopolitics of memory through images, text, and absences, through conversations and video projections, for rehearsing a black, feminist, anti-colonial internationalism and interracial imaginary, for fighting fascism, colonialism, and anti-Semitism, also as an intersectionality of struggle. Allow me to elaborate very briefly on the Miss Seminar before I'm going to introduce Barbara, Yulia, and Vanessa, as well as Avery, as the context for our gathering today. The Miss Seminar is not an absent seminar. It is not an alternative seminar. Perhaps it is a potential seminar, in a similar way as Ariella Aisha Azoulay proposed to think about potential history as a nonlinear and transhistoric trajectory of struggles and lives, which compose the possibility and potentiality to imagine the end of the world as we know it, a world that is in war and injustice, in which people, and specifically women, are suffering and resisting and surviving, and as this moment in Iran, living the future. And I would like to just invoke also all the feminist movements, women movements that are taking place at this moment in Iran on the streets, that have increased. The violence of the state and the regime has increased over the last days tremendously. Many women are imprisoned, are killed, are threatened, even if you post yourself without the hijab somewhere on social media. The police and the Secret Service will catch you and put you and threaten you to put you in prison. The Miss Seminar is a seminar that might have taken place, yet without leaving a document or record behind, at least as far as we know. It might have taken place, but the student was overworked or exhausted to attend, yet she cared. May the Miss Seminar not fill in gaps or complete a picture of historical knowledge that hegemonic power and white ignorance has willfully, intentionally, and brutally created in the first place. Instead, may the Miss Seminar remain what Steve McQueen would consider a hole in the system that Steve McQueen would analyze in relation to the erasures in the FBI files that runs through the whole kind of 67 hours of audio material and 12 hours of visual material. May this hole in the system remain a drive for desire to know otherwise and a time space for turning conflict into potentiality despite or because of differences. And may it foster in the spirit of a student of a Black radical tradition, crossing and enriching and shaping the East in conversation with the South. And here I speak of the East, of course, also of Germany, but also the communist East, the former communist East of Europe, in conversation with the so-called global South, as a continuous thinking with people in the spirit also of Eslanda Robeson. Let me introduce the participants of the seminar today. It is an immense honor and pleasure to welcome Professor Barbara Ransby, who will present an about 30 minutes paper with the title Eslanda Robeson and the Politics of Black Women's Internationalism in the 20th Century. Barbara Ransby is a MacArthur Endowed Chair and Distinguished Professor of History, Gender and Women's Studies and Black Studies at the University of Illinois in Chicago, where she directs the Social Justice Initiative. She is also the author of the award-winning book, Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement from 2003, and the amazing, brilliant biography on Eslanda Robeson called Eslanda, The Large and Unconventional Life of Mrs. Paul Robeson from 2013. Thank you so much for this book and for your work, Barbara. The whole Miss Seminar would not be as it is without your book. So it was an incredible inspiration, an incredible resource for archival material, but also for tracing Eslanda's journeys and friendships. It's great. It's really very important, and it's part of that research display here as well. So, but get the book also, dear audience, get the book. It's a great book and resource. Barbara Ransby is a longtime Black feminist activist, an author and a scholar, and has received numerous awards for her working, including the Angela Yvonne Davis Award. And thank you, of course, so much, dear Barbara, for joining the panel tonight. Professor Yulia Gradskova is the next participant in the seminar. Will present a 15-minute paper on the problems and the limits, but also the necessity and the potentiality of the Women International Democratic Federation, specifically also reflecting on its presence in East Berlin. At least you will be touching upon that. Yulia Gradskova is an associate professor in the history and a research leader at the Center for Baltic and East European Studies at Södertörn University in Stockholm. She is the author of the volumes The Women's International Democratic Federation, The Global South, and the Cold War, that came out in 2021, and the book Soviet Politics of Emancipation of Ethnic Minority Women, that came out in 2018. Yulia also has been co-editor of several books on gender, equality, and post-socialism. Thank you so much, Yulia, for traveling from Sweden to Berlin. You are speaking also from the HKW at this moment, and also looking forward to your contribution very much. Thank you. It's a great pleasure also indeed to introduce Vanessa E. Thompson. Professor Vanessa E. Thompson will respond to Barbara's and Yura's paper by situating them into the contemporary debates on feminism, Black studies, and abolition. Vanessa Thompson is an assistant professor in Black studies at the Department of Gender Studies at Queen's University. Her scholarship focuses on Black studies, anti-colonialism, state violence, and global abolition, critical racism studies, and activist ethnographies. She has published on Black movements in France specifically and in Europe more broadly, and the Black abolitionist world-making. Her most recent publication was a really great pleasure to see that coming out, includes a reader called Abolition, a reader, that is co-edited with Daniel Leuk for Surkamp Publishing House. It's really great to see this circulating, also really importantly contributing to the debates in German-speaking context, but also, as you all know, Vanessa Thompson is author of many books on Black Lives Matter and the Black radical tradition, specifically also situated in Europe. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for joining in, for taking the time and a break, because it's a great pleasure to have you on board, and for agreeing to respond. Much looking forward for hearing you, and it will be a great panel. Much looking forward. It's been a joy for the last months already. Last but not least at all, I also would like to introduce with greatest pleasure Professor Avery Gordon, who has been an important, very important interlocutor throughout the making of the MIST seminar. Avery is a writer, educator, and radio producer. Her work focuses on radical thought and practice, where she writes about captivity, enslavement, war, and other forms of dispossession, and how to eliminate them. Avery's most recent book is The Hawthorne Archive, Letters from the Utopian Margin. And Avery will engage in the conversation after Vanessa's response. We will share the moderation and also engage in the Q&A together. And also this will be the possibility, of course, for the audience to ask questions that will be taken on board from Lama, from the HKW team in the studio, that will arrive on our screens. So, dear audience, with greatest pleasure, you also will be invited to post your questions. Much looking forward to them. And I'll have the great pleasure, dear Barbara, the screen and the mic is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doreen. It's really an honor to be here. Thanks to the organizers of this event, notably Doreen Mende. Thank you for including me and for this focus on Eslanda. I really wish I could be there with you in Berlin to see the exhibit, and it looks amazing. I'm honored to share the panel with Yulia and Vanessa and my old friend and colleague, Avery Gordon. So I will make my remarks brief, 30 minutes, and we have time for discussion. Let me begin by saying that Eslanda Cardoza Good Robeson is best known as the wife of the famous actor, singer, and political icon, Paul Robeson. And in fact, this is how I was first introduced to her, in history books and biographies of Paul and in the archive. And her husband was indeed an amazing talent, an amazing symbol of internationalism, and an unapologetic ally of freedom struggles all over the world. But what I want to talk to you about today is Eslanda as an amazing figure in her own right, and what we can learn from her life, her legacy, and her body of work. And I must say, I do have fond memories of being in Berlin at the Akademie der Künste, looking in the Robeson papers for many, many hours a decade or so ago. I hold that memory very dear. As Doreen said, Eslanda was an anthropologist, a writer, a fierce and outspoken opponent of colonialism and capitalism. She was a strong advocate for women's rights, and like Paul, she was very much an internationalist. And let me just also say parenthetically, I'm giving you a biographical snapshot of Eslanda Robeson's life, so we get a sense of where her ideas and her politics come from. So we get a larger historical context and a view of the community and traditions that produced her. As a biographer, Eslanda Robeson's life provided me with the opportunity to wrestle with some of the major issues, events, and turning points of the early to mid 20th century, and to do so through the lens of a radical Black woman. Eslanda literally stood on the precipice of history on more than one occasion. She witnessed firsthand the ravages of colonialism, the brutalities of war, and the ugly face of fascism. She saw empires unravel and new nations emerge. In terms of her engagement with the African continent, she visited Uganda, South Africa, French Equatorial Africa, Zanzibar, Belgian Congo, all of this in the 1930s and 40s, at a time when international travel was both dangerous and precarious, particularly for a Black woman. She was friends with Jomo Kenyatta and corresponded with Kwame Nkrumah. She went to the front lines of the Spanish Civil War in 1938 to take a stand against Franco and to side with the anti-fascist forces. She was there at the founding of the United Nations in 1945, and she visited Mao's China in 1949, 2 short months after the revolution that formed the People's Republic of China. One of the things I found so interesting about her life is the enormous number of amazing people that animated her life, from Emma Goldman to Claude McKay. But let me also step back and give a little background about her life. She did have a life before Paul. Eslanda Cardoza Good was born in 1895. She was a daughter of middle class parents in Washington, D.C., a family that lived on the cusp of privilege and misfortune. Her maternal grandfather was a famed Reconstruction era politician, her father, a clerk in the federal government with a law degree from Howard University. Eslanda's father died when she was quite young, leaving her, her mother, and her two brothers to sort of fend for themselves, which forced her mother back into the workforce and having to move around a number of times. Her mother, also named Eslanda, was an amazingly formidable figure. She was very influential in her daughter's life and in the development of her political consciousness. The elder Eslanda was an ally and supporter of the Black West Indian socialist Hubert Harrison in the 1910s. She was herself a critical thinker, a woman suffragist, and a militant race woman, and also an internationalist. Now, in 1921, the younger Eslanda became partners in life and later politics with Paul Robeson. This was a pivotal turning point for her. Their partnership, comradeship, and unconventional open marriage would last for 44 years until her death in 1965. A fiercely independent woman whose savvy and political acumen rivaled that of her famous husband, Essie was a powerful persona in the international political and artistic circles from the 1920s through the 1950s. She served as Paul's business manager and really the architect of his early career. She traveled with him as he performed regularly on the theater stages throughout Europe, the US, and later the Soviet Union. Essie Robeson lived a life like few other African American women of her generation. After graduating from Columbia University with a degree in chemistry, she studied anthropology with Bronislaw Malinowski at the London School of Economics. She published 3 books, and in 1945, she became a leading force in the Council on African Affairs. Like Paul, she sided with the downtrodden and oppressed of the world and never missed an opportunity to speak out against their suffering and in solidarity. Both Essie and Paul became outspoken critics of the US government beginning in the 1930s. They had many close friends and associates in the Communist Party USA. Their membership remained somewhat in dispute, although they were definitely very close fellow travelers. They paid a price for these choices. They were both targeted as subversive, spied on by the FBI, blacklisted by the State Department, and in 1950, both of their passports were confiscated. They were also subjects of spying by MI5 and MI6, the British intelligence agencies. All of this had a major impact on Paul's career, as is very well known, and devastated the family's income. They had to sell their home, and many of their fair weather friends abandoned and or betrayed them. In 1953, Eslanda was an uncooperative witness before the Senate Un-American Activities Committee, using her highly publicized testimony to challenge the credibility of the committee itself and to indict its conveners for racism and undemocratic practices. Now, as an aside, we have to remember this is the era of the Cold War and McCarthyism. Numerous people were jailed, exiled, harassed, fired from their jobs for any tinge of support for communism. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg had just been executed for allegedly spying for the Soviets. So it took significant courage on her part to assume the kind of defiant posture that she did. And unlike others who came before the committee, she refused to name names or to apologize for her beliefs or her friends. For 20 years, she took work as a freelance journalist. a UN correspondent, a writer, analyzing international affairs and domestic politics. She wrote hundreds of articles and delivered hundreds of lectures throughout the US and around the world. She spoke at the convening of the West Indies Federation in Guyana in 1958. She spoke to a crowd of many thousands at the Day for the Victims of Fascist Terror in Berlin in September of 1959. She spoke at African Women's Day in London in 1961. And she was a delegate along with Pearl Laws and Ada Jackson at the Women's International Federation Conference in Moscow, also in 1949. As early as 1938, Eslanda had become a radical and uncompromising voice for a range of progressive causes, including independence for all nations suffering under the yoke of colonial rule. She publicly allied herself with militant anti-colonial campaigns and with communist movements. Essie traveled to some 50 countries over the course of her life and career, conversing and arguing in multiple languages on multiple continents. And year after year, trip by trip, she began to piece together a global vision and a worldview and an expanding sense of herself as a Black radical woman. Not surprisingly, the first phase of Eslanda's international awakening, if you will, was her deepening interest in Africa. The year was 1932. It was a critical moment in the process of her awakening, and it occurred in Paris during that fateful summer. For complicated personal reasons, which I talk about in the book, I won't go into here, she found herself in Paris for 2 months that summer. Her escort, confidant, and constant companion was a Dahomean prince. His royal status was later called into question, but a very colorful character named Kojo Tuvalu Hoinu. He was a graduate of the Sorbonne, supporter of Marcus Garvey, and publisher of the anti-colonial journal Le Continent. She had met and befriended him in Harlem in 1924, and they became fast friends. In addition to showing Essie the opera and the nightlife of Paris, he introduced her to Black Paris and to the anti-colonial ideas at the heart of a vibrant, colorful, politically savvy diasporic community. She was amazed and curious. One of the people she met was Martinican intellectual and writer Paulette Nardal, editor of the journal Monde Noir, or Black World. And that journal had stated as its goal to break down the great barriers of isolation that divided the African diaspora. Nardal, along with her sister, held popular salons on the outskirts of Paris that were sites for hearty discussions about politics, literature, and culture. Overwhelmed and excited and determined to know more, Eslanda conducted a series of interviews with the people that she met that summer. And those interviews later appeared in the journal Challenge, which was published by Dorothy West. But her curiosity was piqued. She really wanted to see the continent of Africa for herself. She understood the role that Africa played in the larger geopolitics of the time, and certainly of this time as well. She enrolled in the London School of Economics, where she met Jomo Kenyatta, and he had a profound influence on her, telling her stories of Kenya and other parts of the continent, and challenging some of what they were learning in their classroom. And so her intellectual journey had begun. Her physical journey to Africa began in 1936, when she set out by ship, first to South Africa and then Uganda, with her 8-year-old son in tow, because she was determined that he learn firsthand about Africa, and was determined to dispel some of the racist myths she felt he was learning in school. She was actually encouraged to take this trip by her friend, the great writer Zora Neale Hurston. On the first day of her trip, she was quite emotional, and the entire experience of this first trip to the African continent was both a personal and a spiritual journey for her. Off the coast of Senegal, she wrote, and I quote, "It is a gray and heavy thought that between 1666 and 1800, more than 5.5 million kidnapped Africans, my ancestors, began the dreadful journey across the Atlantic from this very stretch of coast to be sold as slaves in the New World," in quotes. No wonder the sea and sky and very air of this whole area seems sinister to me on this day. Her first extended trip was in her first extended stop on this trip was in South Africa. There she visited segregated Black settlements and witnessed the effects of the harsh pass laws designed to restrict and control the Black population. She witnessed Black workers rounded up on the street and forced into police wagons that reminded her of dog catcher wagons that she had seen back home. And remember, this is before the official infrastructure of apartheid had been put in place, but still very repressive colonial rule. She visited a mining compound called Robinson Deep outside Johannesburg and saw the conditions under which Black miners lived and worked. In the course of her travels in South Africa, she met some of the future leaders of the anti-apartheid struggle. Dr. Albert Zuma, who would serve as president of the African National Congress, and Z.K. Matthews, who would be tried and jailed for his political activities in the famous treason trials of 1956 alongside Nelson Mandela. Fortuitously, she was also able to attend the historic Bloemfontein Conference in what was then the Orange Free State, a historic gathering of anti-colonial leaders from all over the country. At the end of her trip, she wrote about how she felt transformed. The conversations were stimulating, she wrote. I am surprised and delighted to find these Africans far more politically aware than my fellow Negroes in America. And I just want to interject here, her engagement with the African continent in this period when the whole continent, almost the whole continent, was under colonial rule. She goes not in this sort of condescending way that she's bringing some sort of wisdom or light or whatever, which actually not only whites traveling to Africa, but sometimes Black people from the diaspora traveling to Africa had that view, and hers was very different. She saw this as a real moment of her own intellectual growth. By 1946, Eslanda's growing political family was not only Africans, and I want to say here a bit about the theme of Asian solidarity, which became very much a part of her worldview. In London in the 1930s, while she and Paul were there, she met and befriended Jawaharlal Nehru and his sister Vijayalakshmi Pandit, who of course later becomes the first woman president of the United Nations General Assembly. They corresponded, shared time together, exchanged books and articles and ideas, and in the process, they became lifelong friends. So much so that in the 1940s, when Pandit's daughters were studying at Wellesley College, during part of that time, their mother and uncle were actually in prison for their anti-colonial activities in India. Essie Robeson opened her home to the Pandit girls, and they referred to her as their second mama. So her political solidarity was also about personal relationships. This was a gesture that Vijayalakshmi Pandit would never forget. Eslanda also enjoyed a personal relationship with Nehru himself. They exchanged long letters over many years. She mailed him a copy of Richard Wright's book, Native Son, and a report by the National Negro Congress. It was not a relationship without challenges and contradictions, but indeed one that endured. Another example of her solidarity with the peoples of Asia was her support for the 1949 Chinese Revolution. And I also want to say parenthetically that the China of 1949 is not the China of today. I won't say a lot more about that, but we need to view her statements of solidarity and enthusiasm in the context in which it occurred. In 1949, a few months after the Chinese Communist Party seized power and chased the Kuomintang troops to what was then Formosa, Essie went on a women's delegation to the newly established People's Republic of China. There, she met peasant leaders, intellectuals, heroes of the revolution. And when she returned, she agreed to go on a speaking tour around the US and was quick to make links between the workers and peasants of China and the workers and peasants of the Black American South. Applauding the new communist government, she said in one speech, "The new government has emancipated the nation's peasants from the feudal system that has chained them for centuries." Pointing to the segregation and racism under the so-called open door policy in China before the revolution, Essie learned about signs in public parks put up in British-controlled areas indicating no dogs or Chinese allowed. She then made the comparison to the dehumanizing treatment of Black Americans in the Jim Crow South. Alongside Essie's internationalist politics were her proto-feminist politics. And I want to just say something about use of the term proto-feminist. While Eslanda championed the rights of women, African women and all women, she took a great interest in promoting women's leadership. She did not consider herself a feminist per se. Looking back from the vantage point of the 21st century and with the nuance and textured meaning given to feminists by women of color, third world, indigenous, post-colonial, and Black feminists, Essie's words and deeds do look very much like a part of a Black and feminist of color and Black left feminist tradition. She very much resembles the kind of scholars and activists that Mary Helen Washington and Eric McDuffie and Dale Gore and others have described in their work. But I call her a proto-feminist because her gender justice work preceded the emergence of an explicitly Black feminist framework and identification, and she herself did not use the term. In any case, one group she worked with during this period was a group called Sojourners for Truth and Justice. This was a group of radical Black women that included her friends and comrades Shirley Graham Du Bois, Louise Thompson Patterson, and the radical publisher Carlotta Bass. Lorraine Hansberry spoke at their first meeting, and two of the issues they organized around were one, the defense of the Black left scholar W.B. Du Bois, who was being persecuted for his political views, and secondly, they campaigned to free a woman named Rosa Ingram, a Black Southerner who had been jailed for defending herself against a racist attack. Another proto-feminist project that Eslanda was involved in was the All African Women's Freedom Movement, which she co-founded. And the group held forums and endorsed various campaigns. She was a featured speaker at a very well-attended gathering in London in 1961, sharing the podium with Claudia Jones and others. Her work as a correspondent for the United Nations was a really important vehicle for her to share her evolving political views. She was a freelance journalist, book author, and eventually worked for the radical left publication, The New World Review. This was a special post-war moment, the late 1940s and 50s, a moment of transition and decolonization, where the world was in flux and all kinds of changes seemed possible. Political theorist Adam Getachew writes beautifully about this moment full of hope for a world that sadly did not materialize as Essie and others had envisioned. It was Essie's writings in this context that were so powerful. She wrote about Cameroon, for example, the fight by the outlawed Union of the People of Cameroon, the UPC, which came to a head in 1956. She reminded her readers that Cameroon was supposed to be under the jurisdiction and oversight of the UN Trustee Council at that time. However, some UN officials and diplomats were simply looking the other way as France continued to dominate the colony. She later met and supported Inde Tumaza and the One Cameroon movement, and later wrote a letter expressing his gratitude for her, indicating that her name would remain ever fresh in our minds. So she forged these relationships of solidarity through her writing. She frequently and insistently called upon African Americans to see their fate as tied to that of the people of color worldwide. We Negroes are becoming all the more impatient, she wrote, as we learn about what is going on among the colored peoples elsewhere in this great wide world of ours. Our hearts beat faster when we learn that Africans in the Gold Coast are governing themselves and that Africans in Nigeria will soon be doing the same. We hold our breath with anxiety and sympathy for the Africans in South Africa who have organized with Indians and colored people there to resist Milan's vicious policies of apartheid. End quote. Her Pan-Africanism coexisted with her internationalism and her proto-feminism. In 1953, she reported on the Inter-American Conference in Caracas, Venezuela, sharply criticizing the US Secretary of State and applauding the Guatemalan delegation for taking a defiant stance against autocracy in Latin America, and for, in her words, opposing emphatically the internationalization of McCarthyism. She wrote about the Algerians' bold struggle against the ruthless forces of French colonialism. Quote, the Algerian question reveals breaks in the walls of the fortress held by the colonial powers. The role of smaller nations as followers of the big powers has been challenged. No longer can anyone claim the UN is a colonial club. This was the optimism. In this, she echoed the words of another friend of hers, the fiery orator and Nehru ally, UN delegate Krishna Menon, who stood on the floor of the UN and declared, in this room there are at least 20 to 22 states. If an empire cannot be overthrown, if a conqueror cannot be displaced, if lost liberty cannot be re-won, then very few of us have a place here. By 1958, Eslanda traveled to the African continent for the last time. It was a powerful experience. She connected with important women leaders in this trip, as she had done with previous travels. It was a conference of all African peoples, of the All African Peoples Conference in Ghana in December, and Paul had been invited to attend and could not go for health reasons, and so she went in his stead. She spent time at that conference with two women in particular, Seza Nabruli, a leading Egyptian feminist, and Gita Mukherjee, then only 34 years old, an Indian communist and feminist leader. Both of these women she kept in touch with over the course of her life. She bemoaned the fact that more women were not at that conference, but engaged in deep nightly discussions with both Gita and Seza about the role of women in anti-colonial struggles. By the 1960s, as the US Black freedom movement was growing more militant, Essie too became more vocal in linking her own militancy to the US struggle and to global ones. In one essay she wrote, Africans will not turn the other cheek. They are telling the world if you hit us, we will hit back. Revealing her own leanings and her subtle critique of the limit of nonviolence in the US civil rights movement, she posed a rhetorical question. How effective will nonviolence be against the brutality of the French in Algeria or Cameroon, against white settlers in Kenya and South Africa? This militancy continued into the 60s when the Black freedom movement in the United States, in a sense, caught up with Eslanda and Paul's politics. In many articles Essie wrote in 1963 and 64, they had titles like The New Negro Movement, The Long Hot Summer, Black Revolution and White Backlash, and The Time Is Now. She sided with the radical forces of the Black freedom movement, and she was thrilled about the upsurge in protest and the irreverent and determined tone of the new and emergent voices. In conclusion, there are several lessons we can take away from Essie's life and career. Looking at her form of Black internationalism, which is not only about the African diaspora, but about the larger world and freedom-loving people all over the world, her example widens the lens beyond a limited geopolitical context. The concept of the third world and the global south meant a connection between peoples whose lives were impacted by white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism all over. Secondly, she was a part of a steadfast Black anti-fascist movement that we don't hear enough about. Thirdly, Eslanda's story puts women and a network of radical women of color, radical Black women, at the center of this narrative of Black internationalism, a tradition that has been dominated by male historical figures from Garvey to Du Bois to C.L.R. James and James Baldwin. Her story is also a story about Shirley Graham Du Bois, Ada Jackson, Louise Thompson Patterson, Claudia Jones, and many more. Her story foregrounds Black women in global struggles, and it situates the Black left as a part of a larger story of the global left. In some ways, the Robesons were blacklisted in their lifetimes and have been blacklisted by historians. So in telling her story, we engage in a corrective to that narrative, a corrective to that skewed historiography. Eslanda's political genealogy is a global one. It is eclectic and includes not only self-identified Africans and African Americans, but Indians, Chinese, Russians, Guyanese, and many more. Her notion of her global political family with a common heritage of resistance and struggle was not confined to race or even rigid ideology, but deep-seated commitment to freedom and justice, broadly defined. I did not always agree with or fully understand all the political positions and choices that Eslanda Robeson made. Yet, as a Black feminist activist myself, deeply immersed in the Black freedom movement and Black feminist struggles in the US, and deeply engaged in movements against racial capitalism, police violence, and heteropatriarchy, and for many decades, standing in deep solidarity with the struggles of women in Iran, the long suffering people of Haiti, and with the Palestinian people still living under violent occupation. I take great inspiration from the life and legacy of Essie Cardoza Good Robeson, and there's much to discuss in deciphering the implications of that legacy. So I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation. I think I'm passing the mic to Yulia, perhaps.
Yes, Yulia, you're next.
Yes. I cannot hear Yulia.
I cannot hear Yulia either.
Yeah, no one can hear Yulia.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara. It's great. Great paper. Thank you.
Yulia, are you muted?
Okay, wow. Lama, can you hear us? HKW Studio? It did work
Okay,
in the
they
test.
are they are trying to figure that out. Well, maybe I'll just say something till we get Yulia back. Um, um, Barbara, when you gave us that amazing recounting of her travels, it made me think about what an itinerary or itineraries might look like today for that. I mean, what would a woman with Eslanda's politics travel today? Where she would visit, whom she would visit? It would be so different. I don't. You've probably thought about this, but it's sort of interesting to think how you might think about those itineraries today.
Absolutely. Yeah, I won't say more because I think Yulia might be ready now. But absolutely. Yulia is still muted.
So just to say for our audience, we're just having a little bit of technical difficulties here, being able to hear Yulia. So we are waiting. I don't know that it makes sense to go to Vanessa without Yulia speaking.
That's really bizarre because it did work very well like only an hour ago when we tested,
Yeah.
and now
And
Yulia
we're
is
live.
also frozen.
Yeah.
But
Are we live now?
I think we are.
think so. Yes, I
Yeah.
think.
Well,
I think everybody's watching us
we
now.
can chat. We can chat.
We can chat.
I love
Yeah.
Yes.
I love impromptu chats about, you know, yeah. I mean, you asked the question about Eslanda's travels. I mean, and here we are experiencing this technological glitch in our high tech era. You know, she traveled with, there was no internet, there was no, I mean, she barely had access to telephones in many places. The airplanes broke down, you know, they were you know, she was on boats and, you know, going down various river and waterways all over the world. So just the physical challenges of her travel required a certain kind of determination and stamina. But also the world has changed so much, hasn't it? You know, if we were just to map, there's a map of her travels in the book where I was just so overwhelmed by how much ground she covered. Going to those places now, hopeful signs and sad signs. I mean, she saw, you know, the end of colonialism and these emergent movements, and she was so hopeful. And uh, you know, we now see the sort of reemergence of neocolonialism in some places and dictatorships in other places that had such promise. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's
So
quite sobering.
yeah, it's really interesting the contrast between how closed China would be to her visit today, but how
Mm-hmm.
different and open South Africa would be, where she wouldn't be
Yeah.
meeting. I mean, she would be meeting with a very different group of, you could say, anti-government grassroots
Yeah.
movements rather than the nascent
Right.
ANC. Um,
Right.
so that's
Exactly.
also interesting to me that the people that she met with, many of whom, of course, became state actors, that now in the sort of neo-colonial era, she would be meeting with really very different groups of people. Um, and
Mm-hmm.
so that relationship to the possibility of kind of democratic socialist Pan-African states
Yeah.
is gone. Um,
Yes, I know.
yeah,
I mentioned Adam Getachew's book, World Making After Empire, which, you know, does give this just powerful, powerful sense of possibility at that period in the late 40s and early 50s, where the UN was this battleground of, you know, who's going to be there, what can be said there, um, you know, and that's changed too in so
yeah,
many ways, right?
yeah. I mean, the text, I don't know if you all had a chance to look at, well, obviously Barbara's read the text, but um, the emphasis in that text on the war in Korea was very
Yeah.
striking, um,
Yeah.
to me, that she, you know, on the one hand, obviously a sign of the importance of the Afro-Asian solidarity, Barbara, as you pointed out. Also, the WIDF was an anti-militarist organization.
Yeah.
But this war, which is not ended actually, um, was, of course, the direct result of US occupation and partitioning following the defeat of the previous occupier, Japan. And this has been, I mean, one of the really hot wars in the Cold War, completely forgotten in the US. I mean, this is
Yeah.
just completely erased. We go from World War II to Vietnam and
Right.
forget what happened in Korea, and it's still the third largest, you know, military base
Yeah.
location for the
Yeah.
U.S. So
Yeah.
that sense of her, the way she was tracking things, I think, is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and many of her New World Review articles were about Korea as well. I'm curious about Vanessa's remarks. It's so nice to meet you, Vanessa, virtually. So I've known your
Wonderful to
name.
meet you, Barbara. Very grateful to be in
Yeah.
conversation with you. And of course,
Yeah.
Avery and Doreen and Yulia. when I read
Yeah.
the
Lovely
piece,
to
I was
see.
also struck very much by the kind of it reminded me of how this is really needed also today in this
Yes.
kind of conjuncture of in this new conjuncture of war, which is very different than I think than several decades ago, because so many things have reconfigured, right? The question of, like, for instance, that you not
Can you hear
do
me?
certain work anymore alongside the kind of block confrontation, right? That we have to think harder about imperialism in a different way, right? Also to think about now Russian imperialism, for instance, also to think about
Yes.
the various forms of authoritarianism. And I was really wondering what kind of um, how this kind of complexity and how she would grab also with this multidirectionality of
Yeah.
critique and of struggle in this moment. And
Yeah.
I think this also refers to a bit what Avery just said with regards to that the question of neocolonialism, of also how that Kwame Nkrumah already laid out so brilliantly, and Frantz Fanon, right, about the question of like either imitating Europe or the question of the national bourgeoisie than actually just replicating the capitalist interests, and how then the question of how we can think differently about the state, but also how we can actually have to multi-directionalize our critique against these forces, right? Because I think at that time it was still so much U.S. imperialism as one of the major um, enemy, which it still is. And at the same time, there's a long history also of other entangled imperialist formations and colonial formations, and obviously also questions of authoritarianism, which,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I mean, one of the big, I don't want to open a can of worms, but one of the big contradictions that sits at the core of her and Paul's politics, right, was their continued loyalty to the Soviet Union, even when the purges and even when you began to see the authoritarianism of the Soviet Union, they wanted so much, to believe in the socialist and communist project there. And I asked a number of older former members of the Communist Party USA, what were you thinking? She said, in the context of the Cold War, we just didn't want to believe it. We just didn't want to believe it. And so, but you could see what Russia has become now. You could see even in that early period, the emergence of a, kind of, it wasn't state capitalism now, but it was certainly an authoritarian state emerging and betraying many of the hopes of a democratic socialist vision that folks had in other parts of the world and there too.
So Barbara, if we could just pause on that important thought, because Yulia is ready now. They've got her working.
Yay.
So
we were just filling in, Yulia.
Let's let Yulia make her presentation.
I hope so very much that you can hear me now. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
very
you,
well.
Yulia.
Very well, Yulia.
We
Thank
will.
you.
Yes, great.
Thank you. We will, for our audience, we will come back to the topics around militarism and so on after Vanessa. So go ahead, Yulia. Thank you.
Yeah, so sorry for these problems, and thank you again for inviting to take part in such an interesting conversation. And I think exactly I followed your discussion that now is right point for me to intervene, because I'm going to speak about Women's International Democratic Federation, the WIDF, the organization which had been evaluated quite differently in the past, and in the present it is a big discussion among the researchers. So I will start from the federation was founded in Paris in 1945, but it had to leave France and to move its headquarters in Berlin in the context of the growing Cold War confrontation and due to its open support for the struggle of the Vietnam people against the French colonial ruler. The federation started as an organization, transnational organization of about 40 countries, but in the 1970s it became very big and really influential organization where women from 117 countries were taking part. The federation declared its main goal was uniting women of the whole world around the defense of peace, women's rights, and protection of mothers and children. In contrast to other transnational women's organizations working for women's rights during the same historical period, from its first days, the WIDF regarded the rights of women to work outside of home and the state protection of motherhood to be important for its program. And the WIDF saw women's roles as those of mothers, workers, and citizens at the same time. The WIDF, through its big congresses, some of them were already mentioned in this great lecture by Barbara, was creating a meeting spaces for women from different countries, different continents, of different political beliefs, and this was one of the great funds of this federation. The WIDF had a broad political agenda, and already from the beginning, the organization strongly denounced racism and colonialism. At the Congress of Women in Copenhagen, this exactly what was where Eslanda Robeson could not take part. In this Congress in 1953, the Federation's Vice President from Sweden, Andrea Andrén, in her keynote talk noted the differences in salaries between black women and white women in the United States of America that women were receiving for the same work, as well as differences in salaries between indigenous majority women in the colonial countries and the salaries of the European women there. The Federation was repeatedly coming back to the issues of racism, was connected to women who were participating in anti-colonial struggle. It is very visible through the main periodical publication of the Federation, which was called Women of the Whole World, but it was published also in French, German, Russian. It was published and at some period of history of this organization in Arabic. The journal was publishing a lot of information about anti-colonial struggle and about struggle against racism. For example, in the issue of from 1958, the journal issued a lengthy article about South African Women's March on Pretoria, taking part in 1956, and she explained to its readers why apartheid was a dangerous system for women. However, at the same time, the whiteness of the WIDF top leadership, who were coming mainly from European countries, West European countries, leftist women, and East European countries, and also the central that the Soviet and East European women played in this organization often constituted a problem for women fighting against colonialism in Africa and Asia. And from time to time, it constituted also a problem for the Federation itself, for its international status and prestige. I was studying archival materials in research in Moscow, in Amsterdam, in Stockholm, together to the periodical publications. And the archival materials preserved in Moscow suggest that in spite of the newly founded women's organizations representing recently decolonized countries expressed interest towards the WIDF, These encounters did not always have the effect the WIDF expected. The African and Asian women's demands often did not fit to the frames of the WIDF ideological programs based on the defense of peace and motherhood. For example, the classified letter from Berlin to Moscow from 1959 stated, and I quote, according to Argentinian friends, the fact that the Federation does not give enough attention to the problems of struggle for the national independence is a result of lack of representation of countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America in its leadership. The representatives of the European countries do not represent fully the demands of the people of those countries. Another meeting of the Federation, another representative, it was Anasuya Guyanchand, activist of the Federation of Indian Women, who presented report of the Federation of Indian Women at the WIDF Council meeting in Jakarta in 1960. I quote again, it was a fact that the women of Asia and Africa did not play a role in the WIDF, and that with the exception of the Chinese, in some other countries, either whole countries remain outside the sphere of our organization, or the women who were elected to the leading bodies of the WIDF did not represent the leadership of the broad masses of women in countries, so they were in themselves prominent personalities. The criticism of Indian women's organization was not limited to issues of representation. It emphasized also important differences in assumptions about what problems are the most important for countries which are fighting for their independence, or are those countries that reach their independence recently. I quote again the same report of the Indian National Federation of Indian Women. We feel that our friends in Europe and America are too used to looking at different social strata of peoples as industrial workers, capitalists, farmers, or agriculturalists. They find it difficult to understand that different levels of social emancipation exist both in the town and countryside. End of quote. Thus, in addition to these problems of misunderstanding, the wideness and Europeanness of the WIDF top leaders per se started to constitute a problem for the Federation's continued anti-colonial agenda. The Federation in this situation started to pay special attention to show the successes of those countries which were part of the Eastern Bloc and which were having colonial past. In particular, it was concerning countries of the Central Asia. The Soviet Central Asian republics were seen as countries that had a past, and so the WIDF journal published a lot of materials about educational and professional success of women from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and other Central Asian Soviet republics. In the Central Asian, in particular Uzbekistan, became the place where the WIDF organized several conferences and seminars for women and for other conferences for representatives of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But for example, here in 1906, Tashkent was the host for the seminar on education for African women, and there were representatives of several independent and still fighting for independence African countries. There were representatives of Ghana, Guinea, Cameroon, for example, participated in the seminar, and women were writing the reports after the seminar, and the reports show that really many African delegates were impressed by the universities, kindergartens, by their meeting well-educated Soviet Central Asian women. And of course, they will use their experience from this conference for building education for women in Africa. But again, at the same time, it is important to note that the Soviet Union was using opportunity of such international gatherings for promotion of Soviet variant of emancipation of women is the best in the world. While the Federation's journal often published materials on the professional successes and happy motherhood of women living in the Soviet Union and in other countries under the state socialism, in the period of decolonization of African countries, Uzbek and other Central Asian women, Muslim women from Soviet Union more generally, looking up as an example of the greatest change between the colonial backward past and the socialist modernity. In practice, however, the influence and role of women, high positioned women in Uzbekistan and other countries could be questioned. On the one hand, these women were part of the Soviet nomenclatura, the hierarchically organized political class that profited from the system and made important decisions for the Soviet people. On the other hand, they continued to be seen inside of the Soviet Union as representatives rather of Soviet nationalists, so they were not on fully equal grounds with their Russian and Slavic counterparts, and not least due to their ethnic origin and presumed not whiteness. However, as I said, the Federation continued with its attempts of bridging the interests of African, Black American, and Latin American women with its political agenda on protection of peace and motherhood. These efforts were often appreciated. Here, for example, you see W. Du Bois addressing readers of the Federation official publication. He visited Tashkent in 1958 for participation in the African Asian Writers Conference, and then he published this address in the first page of the Women of the Whole World. Still, as the classified documents from the Soviet archives show, not all in Africa were ready to support fully the WIDF agenda. The archival material suggests that the WIDF leaders, at some conferences in the African continent, continued to be accused as buying too white, while the whites, of course, historically were associated in Africa with the colonizers. And also the African and Asian women demands often did not fit within the frames of the WIDF ideological programs based on the defense of peace and food. The classified reports from 1961, for example, suggest that the WIDF leadership was carefully observing what different Western countries, including UK or Northern European countries, are organizing in Africa and what they are doing for Africa women. Always some kind of competition between two blocks with respect to influence over the African women, and this is important to take into account. So this report indicates some discrepancies between the position of the Federation and the position of some African female activists. It stated that some African women's organizations stressed that the solution to the problem of women and children depends on the solution of the problem of national independence, and they considered that the question of detent, which was so important also for the WIDF in defending the Soviet Union, occupied a secondary place compared to independence. Just to conclude, I was trying to describe some context where Eslanda Robeson will cooperating the WIDF, was participating in its activities, acting in its name. It was a rather contradictory context. I wanted to show with this picture from the journal where it is an article written by Eslanda Robeson after her participation in All African People's Conference in Accra in 1958, what Barbara already was speaking about. It is possible to say that her voice, the voice of Black woman and activist, was an important resource for the WIDF, and at the same time the WIDF was a very important for distribution of the ideas of African American women's struggle for civil rights, and for the distribution of ideas of those who were struggling against European colonialism. Eslanda Robeson was a remarkable figure in both of them. So thank you very much for your attention. Do you hear me now?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Yulia.
Thank you, Yulia.
Okay, yeah,
Yes, we can hear
thank
you.
you. So, yes, we can hear you. Thank you. So, thank you, Doreen, Barbara, Yulia. Now we have Vanessa, and you're up now, Vanessa.
Cannot hear her.
No, I think Vanessa is not audible.
Oh,
Maybe there
I'm
is
sorry.
a situation. Ah, no, there you are. Oh, okay, great.
Sorry,
I was
I was just
fearing it
asking if you
hasn't.
can see the presentation.
Yes, yeah.
Everyone? Okay,
Beautiful.
wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I was muted. I don't want to make and cause any other troubles. I was just muted. Thank you so much to Doreen and to Avery and to the people who are taking care of the technical logistics to make this possible. I'm really, really honored to be in conversation with you, Barbara, Yulia, and of course Avery and Doreen. This is amazing. Thank you also for organizing this. I'm speaking to you from the territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. And I also want to mention that I believe that the struggles against settler colonialism and against all kinds of colonial capitalist configurations are deeply connected. And I think that also channels back to what Barbara already referred to with regards to Eslanda Robeson's commitment to internationalism. Before I start, I would also like to give a shout out to the people that were protesting today in Dortmund, because there was a nationwide anti-police protest with the title and the commitment that they are that there's justice for Mohamed Rameh. And the commitment was also there are thousands Mohamed Rameh who want justice for everyone. I unfortunately couldn't be at the talk there yesterday, where I was invited because I'm still struggling a bit with a COVID infection. But today it's much better, so I'm very grateful to be able to be in conversation with you all, and hope that I will not cough too much or can still keep up with the brilliance of the previous speakers. So in these comments, I would like to stress 2 points that actually came across quite strong in Barbara's keynote, as well as in Yulia's talk on the WIDF, and in Eslanda Robeson's text, and tie these 2 questions to contemporary abolitionist feminist organizing in Germany and Europe more broadly. So the first is the aspect or the commitment of an internationalism from below. Because what I find so inspiring in Eslanda's work and political activism is the fierce commitment to internationalism, to liberation as a universal and global project, as her practice and writing showed, did not limit liberation to one national context. Barbara Ransby has discussed her many visits to over 50 countries that expanded her understanding of liberation, anti-colonial struggle, and freedom making. In terms of diaspora, in the 1930s, she made deep political friendship in Paris with the Nadal sisters, who were both actually crucial for the Negritude movement. And in London, she dwelled and engaged with anti-colonial politicians and activisms and politics. These are important sites of Black liberation and anti-colonial liberation more generally, which are not only shaped by the US, quite the contrary. We actually see that Europe has its own right in the history and genealogies of Black radicalism and anti-colonialism. Just think of the Pan-African Congresses in London and Paris, among other places, or the first International Conference of Negro Workers in Hamburg, Germany. These conferences, bringing together anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, and often socialist communist forces, demonstrate that US centrism was not a thing in these times, and that the conditions of Black and racialized oppressed peoples were linked to the global configurations of racial colonial capitalism and imperialism. With her first trip to the African continent in 1936, her engagement, Eslanda Robeson's engagement with Black worker struggles and anti-colonial politics, not only opened her view further to the global dimension of Black liberation struggles, but also to the horizontal engagement with Black radical traditions without hierarchizing one over the other. Internationalism as global and as horizontal thereby shaped her thinking and politics, and also speaks to her mode of traveling. Eslanda Robeson did not travel to center the US in her visits and engagements. She did not travel to make one context universal. Further, her political traveling made her an agent of true internationalism. The second aspect I would like to highlight speaks to the dimension of international solidarity as exemplified in the Afro-Asian solidarity that Barbara has talked about. And I really want to flag this and thank Barbara very much for really sitting with this, because I find it very crucial, as it tells us also something with regards to how we think about Blackness today. Robeson practiced a notion of political solidarity, which we also see unfolding in her support of the WIDF beyond Black or Afro-descendant peoples, and made links between Black workers and peasants, and brown workers and peasants, and yellow and red, if you want to stay in that kind of time frame and vocabulary. I'm reminded here of W.E.B. Du Bois' understanding of the dark proletariat, which is not only shaped by race or color, but rather through the relation of super exploitation, less than free or unfree labor that is needed for capitalist production. Linking the conditions of the dark proletariat beyond formations of race or color is powerful because, as we know from Cedric Robinson, capitalism is a racial phenomenon that did not need Black people to become racial, but rather functions through conjunctures of racism as inherent to capitalist accumulation, meaning it operates through the production of human difference instead of abstraction. I would like to think about these two crucial aspects, internationalism from below and political Blackness, as a form of Blackness that is characterized by the conditions of the dark proletariat, so the structural position within a system that operates through the production and exploitation of difference, by which certain groups are assigned certain forms of labor, or produced as surplus, actually, increasingly in these times of neoliberal racial gendered capitalism, and are therefore pushed towards premature death. We find articulations of these forms of internationalism and political Blackness, especially in the politically Black feminist collectives, such as the Brixton Black Women's Group, that existed from 1973 to 1985, and was strongly engaged in internationalist anti-colonial politics, as well as struggles against domestic state racism, policing, and migration regimes, especially but not exclusively how they affected Black working class women. And here I'm already referring to that kind of political Blackness. The 1970s, as many remember, was a period of counter-revolution of the state, as well as the rollout of neoliberal restructuring, strengthening of migration control, and expansion of the punitive state, from welfare warfare to workfare warfare, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore reminds us. In France, groups such as the Coordination des Femmes Noires, founded in 1976 and active until 1982, had a similar focus, especially regarding their anti-colonial internationalist feminism. They worked alongside radical left women, migrant workers from Latin America, and many other parts of the world. In Germany, Black feminists in the mid-1980s also came together, and when the wall fell, Black German feminists and lesbians also created the feminist organization ADEFRA, Afro-German Women, which served as a sister organization to the Initiative of Black People in Germany, and various regional ADEFRA chapters in major cities across Germany were formed. Some chapters, at the beginning at least, were also rather shaped by political understanding of Blackness. So actually working together in these groups, not only with Black people considered as Afro-descendant. It is important to note that many of these collectives and movements directly connected two genealogies of anti-colonial struggles, struggles of migrant workers and for women's rights and against fascism, because I think it's very important to remember with regards particularly to the European context, but not solely, that that in the 1980s, you also see a rise or a re-emergence of neo-Nazism and fascism, and you had many of these groups actually that were struggling against fascist or neo-fascist, neo-Nazi forces, particularly obviously in many parts of Germany, but also when you think of the Brixton Black women's groups or many of the groups in France. The late 1980s marked a strengthening of many of these movements as well as the founding of new ones, especially around the question of migration, borders, and policing. In France, the sans-papiers movement, in which women played a major role, emerged and directly focused on state violence, the precarization of super-exploited migrant workers, deportation and border regimes, as well as linked these struggles to struggles against neocolonialism and extractivism in the former colonies. Migrant feminist groups such as Femigra in Germany focused on similar struggles and further mobilized a form of political Blackness as they departed their struggles from the structural location of female migrant racialized super exploited workers. And I think it's important to say that in different German contexts, this had different articulations, right? So for instance, in France or in Britain, that could also mean, definitely working together under this umbrella of political Blackness with colonial migrants or post-colonial migrants from South Asian contexts. In the German context, that also meant working together with migrants, labor migrants from, for instance, southern parts of Europe, right, or eastern parts of Europe. So here again, the question of the conjuncture of racism for that specific context is also important in terms of how we understand the mobilization and the formation of political Blackness. Collectives such as Women in Exile or International Women's Space in Germany, both self-organized refugee women's collectives that struggle at the intersection of migrant labor rights, against policing and borders, against population controls and neocolonial politics and orders, against war, and they mobilize a similar notion, as they are not limited to Blackness, understood as being Afro-descendant, but rather depart from the structural location of feminized, racialized, super-exploited and super-exploited labor and surplus relations. So what characterizes many of these groups is their abolitionist horizon, as they struggle against state and suprastate violence, which are articulations of war, such as policing and borders, as well as connect these two struggles against neocolonialism and extraction in formerly colonized countries, with a focus on violence instead of just labor. Tough labor, productive as well as reproductive labor, also plays a crucial role, of course, as these collectives mobilize against the super exploitation of especially migrant women and non-binary folks. In my work, I have referred to these mobilizations as surplus people's projects. And I'm indebted to comrades in South Africa here who, doing a reading group organized by Kelly Gillespie and Lay and Naido, pointed me to the Surplus People Project in South Africa, which was founded in the 1980s to support communities against apartheid state forced removals, and today support community struggles for agrarian transformation, including food sovereignty, equitable land ownership, and alternatives to dominant models of production. So these collectives and movements organized not only on the basis of labor, but on the basis of being rendered surplus in this stage of racial gendered capitalism. So these projects, collectives, and movement formations connects to groups that are exploited and abandoned, from Hamburg to Lampedusa, from Berlin to Tripoli, and thereby build power. Blackness as a structural position of super exploitation and surplus within racial gender capitalist modes of production is mobilized here as what Catherine McKittrick calls a black sense of place. Blackness is a basis here for collective struggle and abolitionist wealth making. This of course includes the multiplicities of struggles of working class, working poor, stateless, and surplus folks, as the migrant collective Black Vests in France mentions: strikes, blockades, disturbances of capital infrastructures and flows, campaigns, protests, and riots. Part of this struggle is figuring out the various ways to connect with all kinds of folks, as well as to practice the world, to rehearse it, to build friendship and relations, as Beatty from Women in Exile often says, as a feminist practice of birthing the world we need to build in order to save us all and the planet. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Doreen, Yulia, Vanessa, for these just really wonderful, very thoughtful presentations, and also for the fabulous documentary photos from Yulia and Vanessa. That was great. So we have about 30 minutes, and what I'd like to do is just start by allowing Barbara and Yulia to respond to Vanessa, and Doreen, also you can feel free to jump in. So let me hand it back to you, Barbara and Yulia.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of soaking it in. I really appreciated both papers enormously, and just Vanessa's is fresh in my mind. And I wish I had been. Were you actually in New York for the Freedom as a Place event with Ruthie last weekend, Vanessa?
Yes, I was there.
You
Yes,
were
it was
there. Very
amazing.
good. I'm glad COVID didn't interfere. But raising up, I'm glad you brought up the Surplus Peoples Project. I think, as a historian, we assess a figure like Eslanda Robeson in her time, and Avery raised during the little pause we had at the outset, how much the world has changed and how we negotiate different contradictions in this period, and a different landscape, right? And the map of freedoms and unfreedoms has changed so enormously. So I appreciate this introduction. I appreciate both the historical memory, in terms of the kind of offering of Yulia, about the WIDF, but also, introducing the notion of abolition and how does abolition reckon with history? Because the abolitionist project, of course, abolition of slavery was one historical project, which was like the current abolitionist movement, was as much, if not more, about freedom making than about, systems destruction, right? And Ruthie reminds us of that so often. And I think Eslanda's work, I didn't talk about this as much, but her work and her voice was as much about visioning as it was about critiquing, that she saw in these, emergent movements that people she met with in Congo and Uganda and South Africa and elsewhere, the possibilities of world making that had not yet unfolded. And so I'm reminded of the radical imaginary, both across borders with WIDF, despite efforts to deploy it for the purposes of Soviet propaganda at times, but that cross border transgression, right? The violation of borders as an act of freedom making and freedom place making. And then in contemporary times, abolition in the 21st century means an engagement with the sort of corrupt forms of state capitalism. We can call it state socialism or state capitalism. That might be another discussion. It seems more that state socialism has evolved to forms of state capitalism. But what does it mean to talk about abolition in the 21st century in contrast to that moment of both transnational organizing and simultaneous kind of post-colonial nation building? So I'm just processing all of these things as we talk, and I'm particularly interested in how we see connections to contemporary solidarity movements, both the places that we remind one another about and the places we don't. Two places on my mind today are Palestine and Haiti, that need much more of our attention and passion and solidarity, and voice. So maybe I'll stop there. That was more amusing than a formal response, but I really appreciate it. A lot of times on panels like this, I'm not taking notes, but actually I was, in both Yulia and Vanessa's presentation, that were reminding me of things that I want to remember. ADEFRA is one. And also I think to talk more about this question of racial gendered capitalism and political blackness and what that means in this moment, in the moment of Afro-pessimism and narrow definitions of blackness that threaten and stand in juxtaposition to that internationalist tradition. So I'll stop there. Maybe Yulia has some thoughts.
Yeah, yes, thank you very much. I missed part of the discussion, so probably I will connect. I think the most interesting discussion you had exactly when I had technical problems, something about two imperialisms, and it will connect, of course, to the situation today. So I think it is very important. Sorry, it is very important to study further this historical, very complex problems of political activism, imperialisms. They're very complex and multi-layered, and we need more information about it, because I really believe that they are connected to the present day. And for example, this ideas what I was finding also in my archival materials, like problems of racism and problems of colonialism, they exist somewhere far away. Yes, and so these two big blocks, both of them, Eastern Bloc and Western Bloc, they were thinking that these problems of racism and imperialism, they existing somewhere else, but not at home. So I think here we can make connection with the present day situation, not least with the Russian war on Ukraine, because this is kind of a new transformation of imperial politics, and we still need more time and more energy to analyze how did we end up in this horrible situation with a horrible war. But I think learning from history of the Cold War could help somehow. So I will stop here. I'm very grateful for so interesting and so informative presentation. I also was making some notes, so thank you very much.
Doreen, would you like to comment?
Yeah, briefly. Thank you so much also, Vanessa, for situating the transhistoric narratives and the writings and what Eslanda Robeson allows us to think with. I mean, all her writings are so extremely situated in very concrete situations. And Barbara, you were mentioning also, now we have attendance here in the seminar, which is very nice. At the research table here, I'm at the there. Now you were also mentioning like Eslanda's attendance of so many different conferences. She was at the founding conference, the so-called San Francisco Conference in 1945, 48, I think. That was constitutive for the foundation of United Nations. And what I find striking about Eslanda, and you also, Vanessa, have been talking about it, is this internationalism from below. and a practice of a radical solidarity, of a political blackness, where Eslanda allows us to imagine the possibility to live a struggle between macro politics and micro politics. I mean, how did she do that? How could you continuously insist of, I mean, the African journal, the book ends with Africa is people, a very, very important kind of statement that she picks up on also later in a text on African opinion on colonialism, that the question of colonialism and the resistance also of colonialism must depart from the practice of the people. And at the same time, and Barbara, you were really elaborating on that also beautifully, that she comes from a political context and a cultural context that is quite really established. And she had a life that not so many other African-American women of her time had. She comes from a very highly political also family of political leaders. Her, I think, grandfather was already one of a very important black political activist in the abolitionist movement. And this is something I find really, and also like Yulia, how you are pointing us to the problematics, internal contradictions of the WIDF. And Eslanda speaks there on the opening also conference. She continuously contributes that. She is also a guest of the state of GDR, more precisely of the Peace Council in late 50s, early 60s, to come to the GDR. And there's her beautiful text called Kidnapped, exclamation mark, a true story, where she describes the escape from London, where Paul, he is ill, and Eslanda really escaped the media hunt and the political hunt against them. They are flying via Polish Airlines, arriving in Berlin-Schönefeld. And this is so important. I mean, what one reason to realize the misdemeanor in this specific moment is a continuous observation of a political depression that we lived through in the last, I would say, 20, 30 years after the end of the Cold War, and the erasure and the silencing of those memories, the memories also of a communist horizon, of a political project, let's say, of a Pan-African internationalism, of an anti-colonial internationalism, of an internationalism from below, that always was intention, somehow connected, somehow in relation with macro politics, with state politics, and where this is so kind of, I just lost this one thought I was really trying to make, that she speaks of the Peace Council, she speaks of the WIDF, and I guess it will come back. I just wanted to make one pertinent point that for me has become really important, the political depression of the present, the erasure of the geopolitics also of a communist East, let's say, that stands in relation with the geopolitics of the so-called global South, is also an erasure of the lives and the struggles of Paul and Eslanda in East Germany. And this was a very important reason for me in the collective conversation with so many people to realize that misdemeanor as a point of departure, to insist in the practice of study and to insist in an intersectionality also of memory politics, fighting colonialism, intersectionally connected with fascism, intersectionally connected with anti-Semitism. In this specific moment also we are living it. We had all these debates going on in the last year here in Germany around anti-Semitism. And the East is continuously erased as much as Paul and Eslanda Robeson are erased, standing it for a black, radical tradition that is inscribed in that geography, not only for the last 60 years, but for 300 years, and if even not longer. But we specify, crystallize that with Eslanda in that kind of constellation and conversation. So that's an ongoing kind, I think, conversation. And I was really, I was struck by Barbara, you were saying in your presentation, just so I did write it down, where you were saying something about that her political practice is situated in her personal, in the politics of friendship. And I find this really, this is one of the main threads also of what we have been trying to do here. And how could we think that this politics of friendship as a political practice in relation to state infrastructures? Um, I mean, this is for me where also the question of decolonizing socialism is situated, to decolonize communism, socialism from that kind of binarism of the macro and the micro. I mean, how could we return to that practice that Eslanda and Paul have been rehearsing and living and transmitting? There are many different thoughts I think I brought in and brought up, but like questions that are ongoing, and it's great to think with you. I mean, also Vanessa, to bring that internationalism from below in relation to political blackness. How does it situate into the question of abolitionism? So maybe we could elaborate on that further, because I think there are some very important possibilities and proposals we can think with and take with. Thank you.
There are two things that come to mind when you're speaking, Doreen. Do we have questions yet? If not, we
There's
can.
no,
We're
yeah,
in
we're
very
just gonna
very
finish
fine
without them.
company here
We
with
just
each
have
other.
our own
Yeah, yeah.
questions, yeah.
That's great. When you say this question of transnational friendships, I mean that was very important for Eslanda and building trust and building the sense of the sort of framework of family is so fraught, but in some ways it was a redefinition of chosen family, right? To build trust, to counter the sort of alienation and vilification and distortions across cultures and borders that so much allow us to be victims of all kinds of propaganda, and so her friendships, but her friendships were also byproducts of her privilege, because she was able to move around and she was able to travel and she was able to attend certain kinds of things, which is, today actually we have many transnational friendships and bonds of trust that develop on on through social media. People, in Gaza expressing solidarity with young people in Ferguson, or people in you know Jamaica expressing solidarity with people in Tahrir Square during the Egyptian Revolution. But I do want to speak to this question of sort of cross class solidarity, because I think this becomes an issue in our own time, and especially in the Black Freedom Movement, when academics speak about the experiences of working class people, sometimes divorced from working class people. I think somebody like Eslanda Robeson, with her enormous privilege, and she did have enormous privilege from, she was willing to risk it, and she lost some of the certainly material things that she had in her life. But how do we navigate going into spaces and not ignoring different positionalities, but also not allowing that to paralyze us and to prevent us from forging alliances? I mean, one of the, part of I grew up in a working class family in Detroit, and neither of my parents went to college, and so I always felt like I was in a strange land in academia, and mostly my people were not there. My people broadly defined, but people who aren't often welcomed in academia, including working class people. And so a lot of my project has been to honor reservoirs of knowledge and epistemologies that emerge outside of the academy, and that some of my best teachers have been there, to also kind of expand the boundaries of campuses to include folks who are doing practice and thought outside of the academy. And I think, when I look at Eslanda as a kind of unconventional intellectual, she didn't finish at LSE. She never held an academic position. She sometimes struggled to get published. She certainly struggled to get out of Paul's shadow, and to be taken seriously as a thinker, as a journalist, as a writer, at that time. But she also honored the knowledge that came from people who were not formally trained. I mean, the people that she met all over the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where she talks about them not not in a folksy way, like in an anecdotal way, but like they taught her about colonialism. They taught her about struggle in very sophisticated ways. And so, I think that's a part of our task too, as in this spirit of what um, Vanessa raised in terms of solidarity and internationalism from below and a feminism from below, is to look at to one, try to speak in accessible language, but also to learn from and honor the knowledge communities that exist outside of a privileged and sort of reified um, environs of the academy. And so that's something she makes me think of as a certain kind of intellectual work that she did, and a certain kind of solidarity that she did.
Yeah, if I could just jump in here for a second, because I think that that's, you know, one of the things that was kind of amazing about what you did in such a really short amount of time, Vanessa, was to really chart the lineage and the trajectory of the change in the actual movement form, from the 30s and the 40s to the 70s, 80s, and beyond, in which in many ways the forms that you're talking about when you start talking about groups like the Brixton Women's Group or the Sans Papiers and France and so on, that these are already um, organizing forms that don't really look like the models that the Robesons were involved in. I mean, we're not talking about party politics anymore. The possibility of a GDR making the invitation, providing refuge, and so on, this is over. And so it's the internationalism from below, as you're calling it, have produced in some ways, very kind of rich communities of resistance now that that you. So from an academic standpoint, you are then amplifying and historicizing in a way that I think is very significant. Um, and then the question comes, well, from a tactical political point of view, how are these um, um, dispersed but nonetheless abolitionist in some ways not, all these practices and smaller communities of resistance and so on, how do they function at a scale that can actually deal with um, the analytic horizon that is also now pretty broad. And I mean, this is always for me the ongoing question, also for the intellectual, is then the analytic horizon, the diagnoses of how we understand the intersectionality at the level of what we're grappling with. That's tough, yeah.
If I
I don't
can,
know. Yeah.
okay, you answer.
No, please go first, Yulia. Please go first. I'll go after you.
No, I just wanted to say mainly going back to what Doreen said, probably again returning to the point about South-South solidarities and East-South solidarities, how problematic they are, and still how important is to not to forget them, not to simplify everything, just saying that this is nostalgia, post-Soviet nostalgia, post-GDR nostalgia, or whatever how it is called sometimes, because I really think that marking it's extremely negative experience, or not studying it, kind of taking it away from history. It does not make us more capable to meet the demands of the present day, not to be a better activists if we do not learn from that period. So I really think that it was important point. And in particular, what was said about this activism from below and internationalism from below, I think this is now the time when we see many examples of it, and so it is very important to study also um, what was developing in the period of the Cold War. Because it can help us to understand we are not living in such easy times, yes, politically. So in order to be active today, it is very important to study how activism, transnational activism, was developing during the Cold War. Thank you.
Vanessa, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for these wonderful and so thought-provoking engagements. I maybe wanted to pick up on what Julia just said and then maybe say something briefly about what you raised, Avery, and also Barbara, and I think also Doreen at the beginning. I just have to second this. The Southeast solidarities are so important. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I don't want to center this because, you know, the war in Tigray, there are many, many wars that are not
Yes.
talked enough about with regard to what is
Yes.
going on there. So, but I think what we've seen there was also a kind of, you know, and we saw that with Syria already, a kind of helplessness of some folks who can, a lot of folks actually, who consider themselves part of the radical left, yeah, also globally. And I think what I found so important was that I then saw several engagements like internationalism. I think it's even called internationalism from below, like podcasting conversations between folks from Syria and Ukraine. And then folks from Sudan actually were in engagement with folks from Ukraine about the revolution. And that was so important to not always have these kind of conversations centered by a Western perspective, because I think there's much to learn from Southeast engagements and not just north south, right, engagement. So I really want to second that with regard, and also what you said, Julia, with regards to the nostalgia, um, and maybe
Hmm.
that also picks up to what you said, Doreen, to work through the failures also of the radical imaginations. Bini Adamczak has obviously written on this with regard to the Russian Revolution, right? Like to work through the failures and the pitfalls, that's part of our trajectory, like to engage with these histories and these failures. Sarah Salem is looking at that with regards to anti-colonialism on the African continent and drawing on your work, Avery, by really thinking about how actually this kind of failure is haunting the new configurations of freedom making. And I think there's much to do in terms of working through these histories, like you said, Julia. With regards to political blackness, and maybe we can also bring Haiti in here because Haiti is the compass, one of the strongest compass of abolitionist politics, also today, not just historically, right, through the Haitian Revolution. And I find it very interesting to see how political blackness already unfolded there during the Haitian Revolution. That it was also Polish land workers that were actually fighting also for to kick the French out and actually for liberation, right? And that's, I think, one of the, not the first, but a crucial manifestation of political blackness. And it shows us that identity might matter, but it could never be our sole orientation in terms of how we frame our radical politics. And that's maybe something, Julia, because I think it was so powerful how you showed how there were also so many differences that had to be worked through, but we do that through struggle. It's not going to work if we're actually detaching from the struggle. It needs that kind of struggle to work through this. And in terms of the internationalist configuration, Avery, that's something I'm really struggling with every day, because with a lot of the movements I myself part and closely work with. And I think what is good is that a lot have worked themselves, or maybe never were, like a lot of the migrant movements, for instance, bound to a methodological nationalism. But I think with the counter revolution, we've been falling also back to a kind of methodological nationalism. I see that often with regard to, for instance, how the Black uprisings in 2020 unfolded, right? And how so much is known about the US, but not about what is happening in Nigeria, and that's what is happening in Haiti. And how we can actually also really challenge that US centrism that how you showed, Barbara, was already so, this challenge was so practical, brought to life, to overcome it, the US centrism in Eslanda's work. But the question of what kind of infrastructure do we need to scale these projects up, done by these movements themselves, is a crucial one, because I think it needs an abolitionist international. I think in many forms it's already there, but I think we need own infrastructures, internationalist infrastructures that have to be filled to really push for new forms of internationalism.
Yeah, I agree. Let me just say quickly, because it is just 1 minute past 7 and we are supposed to end at 7, that we can go for another 3 or 4 minutes or something, just to take 5 minutes beyond our time. So I want to let Yulia and Barbara really have the last comments here, please, before we say, thank you, and we'll keep on talking in some other form.
You want to go, Yulia, or you want me to go?
No, really, I said already mostly what I wanted to say. Just wanted to thank you, all the participants. It was very interesting for me. I was learning a lot, as I said. I was taking notes. So I think we need more this kind of conversations. We need to continue. So thank you very much to the organizers.
Yes, likewise, ditto. Yeah, this is Saturday morning where I am, and so, normally Saturday morning is a decompressed time, and I was sort of revving up for this, and I'm so glad that I was able to be included, and, sorry we're not all in the same place, but I really appreciate this and hope this is part one of some continued conversations with each of you. I just wanted to speak on the question of political blackness a little bit, very briefly. And just to me, there's sort of three components to it that we've touched on a couple. One is, of course, in the struggle for Black liberation, there are non-Black, phenotypically Black actors, and I think of my dear friend Ann Braden, who was a militant anti-racist Southerner in the U.S. for her entire life, and took blows for it. And when I teach U.S. Black history, she's a part of it, and I show a photo of her, and people kind of like, whoa, she was light skinned, but and I have to kind of contextualize. The other part, I think, which is really important to articulate now, particularly among those of us in Black freedom struggles, is that the interests of Black people have a commonality and a greater divergence today than ever before, and primarily along geographic and class lines. And people have made decisions, particularly in, I think, the U.S. and Europe, and we see some of the conservative faces emerging in Britain now are Black faces, right? And we see, this election cycle in the U.S. has been some of the most vicious and, I would say, anti-Black political voices. So it forces us to really, deconstruct notions of Blackness and connect it to the political. But I also want to say this: there is Blackness. There is. In other words, there are communities that might not consider themselves politicized that are bearing the brunt of white supremacy, even if they're not directly, intimately involved in organized resistance. And some of those forces are involved in various forms of everyday resistance or spontaneous forms of resistance in the uprising, and need to be brought in to give leadership to, the sort of more formalized movements around opposition to racial capitalism and heteropatriarchy, and struggle around heteropatriarchy being a key part of that we didn't talk enough about, but I'm glad you in your language of Vanessa, pulled us back in and reminded us of the feminist challenge in all of this to be centered. Much more to say, much more to talk about. We didn't even talk about just organizing work that's going on in the different places that we are, which is always, a challenge for me to figure out. Can't figure it out by myself, but glad to be in community with many of you and trying to do that going forward.
Well, I think we're about out of time. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Yulia. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Doreen. Maybe Doreen will plan another session of the MIST seminar, and we can continue to take up these really crucial, important issues. I mean, my observation is, in a way, we have channeled Eslanda's legacy here in the presentations, the discussions, the attempting to really parse the questions for, as Vanessa put it, the conjuncture that we're in today. And that's a huge collective task. And so I thank you all for your work and your contribution to this seminar today. And thank you, Doreen, for really organizing us all, and to the Hakeve staff who you can't see, but who have been keeping this event going today.
Yeah. I'd love to see that exhibition, Doreen.
It's on display
maybe
till
some
the 30th
images.
of
I am
December.
more lucky. I
Yes.
saw it. It's interesting. Yeah.
I can imagine.
Thank you.
Thank you
much.
so much.
Thank you all.
Great.
To be continued. To be continued.
Absolutely. Yeah. Take care.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye.